This talk, this piece of rhetoric, this argument, these feelings, this presentation came to me all in one last night, and I wrote it up as I spoke it out loud to myself. So it's verbatim as I received it, if you like, as a writer inspired to speak to you today. And I'm going to be speaking to you very much as an artist and a writer. The books I write all enact a form of orphan power, by which I mean a dramatic dynamic between a child and a carer or guardian figure, in which the child or literary character I am speaking through is typically an orphan. I've noticed that even with my latest work, there's always a character hovering on the edge, potentially outcast, an odd number, an orphan, a character without a clear lineage or a definite, traceable genealogy. I think this is because, I know this is because, I'm interested in the idea of social exclusion. Someone who is sent out of society or kept out of the mainstream culture. You might say the true artist, and I do say that, the true artist, because of their inability to integrate, perhaps, because of their oddness, because of their singular or unique character. I find such characters to hold special powers, creative, magical powers. In the case of my first fully literary novel, Girl with Dove, there was a character or characters standing in for me, someone who is me and not me. And in order to create that set of characters, I had to send myself away from myself. I had to make myself into an orphan, creatively speaking. When I started Girl with Dove as an artist, rather than as a commercial writer, we had to pretend that I was Jeanette Winterston reincarnated to get me through marketing. I was quite sure I did not want to write a straightforward confessional memoir as the market is demanding at the moment, because I was quite sure that none of the subtleties and none of the work which most interested me could travel through that form. I would be positioned as the girl who had signed herself into care, and nothing of my internal life would ever appear, although it was my internal life that allowed me to make that audacious decision. And when I say it was Jane Eyre who took me there, I really do mean it. Jane Eyre, whither wander you? By the time I'd finished reading Jane Eyre, I knew that you can find missing people inside books. Jane Eyre, who reads a lot of books, calls these natural sympathies. Sympathies are relatives you never knew you had, the ones you always wanted. Sympathies are family ghosts and fairies, and sympathies keep you up at night. Yes, they do. Jane, whither wander you? Girl with Dove. I was a very fortunate child. There is absolutely no reason to feel sorry for my younger self, or even my current self, disabled by the vaccine. I believe strongly in continuous selves, and I have learned a great deal about how to use my orphan power. A phrase I have to attribute to the writer Will Self after I interviewed him. You have what my mother would call orphan power, he said. Perhaps he meant because I did a good job of interviewing a charismatic and interesting, rather tricky man called Will Self. In any case, you must not feel sorry for me, because at a very young age, I had already created an enormous internal family, and that family was largely of Victorian provenance. Perhaps because I grew up in a cold, late Victorian seaside terrace, I would like to say it was a villa, but that wouldn't be true. A house, it was, yes, but it was also a slum. However, in the worldview adopted by my mother and aunt, with whom I lived in that slum with very many other characters, that slum was quickly turned into a fantasy ballroom, a palace. And we were, as they seemed to believe, aristocrats. Think Cinderella, think glassy chandeliers catching the light, twinkle, twinkle. Think Wedgwood china on the mantelpiece. I'll have some of that. Inspired, therefore, by the extravagant fantasies of my first family, no doubt, and even the crumbling bricks and mortar around me, no doubt too, I soon became a voracious reader of Victorian novels and mysteries. And I include in that very first set of novels I devoured Agatha Christie's Miss Marple stories. Because Miss Marple is definitely a Victorian. She's located in that era by Christie, her creator. And she's born into that era as a character, as was Agatha Christie herself. The figure of Miss Marple is most certainly a popularised Victorian-style fairy godmother of the sort beloved by Charles Perrault, he of the Cinderella tale. All of Miss Marple's seemingly magical powers of intuition and divination originate from Victorian fairy tales, or those fairy tales beloved by the Victorians. The Arabian Nights, The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, and all the English folklore and fairy tales of changeling children, which also includes William Shakespeare, with his changing children. See A Midsummer Night's Dream for starters. Aged about 8, I adopted Miss Marple as my personal internal Victorian fairy godmother, my sympathetic supervisory force. And I was sure that when I grew up, I was going to be a version of Miss Jane Marple. I started to believe I was Miss Marple, and I could be her, that fairy godmother with her special magical powers. So what do you, Miss Marple? But what were her special powers? What were they? Firstly, to dig deep into knowledge of others and the characters around her from her beloved village of St. Mary Mead, to dig out the truth of the character in front of her, which was, if we speak through the language of adoption, a kind of fostering or internal adopting of the traits of another person's life and history. Miss Marple, you see, is interested in sympathy. And sympathy, as Jane Austen shows us, and as the entire 18th century Enlightenment project tells us, instructs us, Adam Smith, David Hume, Lord Shaftesbury, sympathy is not the same as empathy, which our world is currently wed to and selling rather hard. As I see it, empathy can often be, not always, but can be a much easier and more easily applied, perhaps, dare I say, lazier mode of pretending to know the other, because it doesn't require all the complicated case notes and historic details and historic imagining and even kindness, I would say, that sympathy asks for. That is, a great deal of imagining and acceptance of difference. Because sympathy strongly suggests that we are not the same as the other person in front of us, and we have not led their life, or perhaps anything even close to it, although our desire for empathy might tell us so. We do not know all the details of their circumstances, many of which will remain hidden, undisclosed. Remember that will that wicked Aunt Reed keeps locked away from her niece, who she despises, Jane Eyre. The letter and the will that would tell Jane she has in fact a wealthy uncle in Madeira who would like to adopt her, who could potentially love her. Sympathy takes a lot more work. You have to read to the end of the novel and not jump to conclusions at the start. The will appears late in the novel, and it is hidden away in a drawer, like the drawer in front of me. Aunt Reed's drawer. It belongs to her, but not Jane. Sympathy, then, is a more difficult and complex relationship, and it takes time, the whole length of a complex novel at least, and the historic passing of time. Hours, if not years, of listening and observing the other. That is to say, a real and lasting relationship. Perhaps even a marriage. Certainly some sort of real and bonded kinship. And so, in a truly sympathetic world and in a sympathetic imagination, I, as a writer, could not substitute Jane Eyre for myself entirely, or myself for Jane Eyre, because I did not have an aunt like the cruel Aunt Reed of Gateshead House. I did have an aunt, and I was aware that my mad Aunt Di, my unhappy Aunt Di, my unwell Aunt Di, who appears in Girl with Dove, did not mean to be cruel intentionally. Her madness was delivered by something quite other. Her own suffering and her own history, her own childhood, her own forsaken heart. And so you see, even Aunt Di had to be properly assimilated and adopted in my heart and mind. I could not leave her out in the cold if she was going to work within the world of my novel. I had to rehabilitate her. I had to try and see through the screaming and the shouting, the livid faces and the swearing. You little... I had to hear more. But to go back to this idea of adoption, and what I'm calling orphan power. This adoption of two literary characters initially in my own inner life, and then in my writing life. The character of Miss Marple, who stands in for my elder self, and the character of Jane Eyre, my younger self. These two characters I had to imaginatively and sympathetically adopt in order to write my first coming-of-age novel, Girl with Dove. What is more, they had to adopt each other. They had to be in a sympathetic relationship, one to the other, for it to work. They had to go arm in arm and travel the world together. The world of my novel. Years later, I've begun to realise that this process of imaginative adoption is in fact the process I undergo every time I create a new character with a new history and a new biography. In other words, this process of adoption has nothing to do, or little to do, or less to do with the fact that I was once a child, aged 13 or 14, who signed herself into care, who went through several muddled encounters with state institutions, and who was in fact abandoned to a place quite similar in her mind's eye to the school that Jane Eyre was left to moulder away in, Lowood School, a wretched institution. A place in my life called Colwood. The younger self, who was indeed for some time living in an emergency foster family situation with a family name which sounds just like the kind of family you might meet in Charles Dickens' Bleak House, a family called the Muddle family. A true fact. But now this process of adoption and orphan power means something much more to me as a writer. And it's this that I want to get at now, very briefly. Every time I start to write, I have to encounter the sense of myself as being inadequate to the task before me, of pulling out of thin air, so it seems, a new and implausible character. A character that my reader will adopt, as I will also adopt. And then this must happen too. There must be a second adoption. The reader and the writer must also travel together through this very awkward process of getting to know somebody they hadn't known before, this new character. And so there is this awkward tripartite relationship, a family of three traveling around together, trying to get to know each other. Writer, reader, character. It's a strange kind of travelling circus act of a family. So now, let me give you an example from my recent writing life so you can see and hear it as it really is for me, this process of adoption, this muddling through into family, creative family life. I started a new book called Pond Man. Let me tell you briefly about Pond Man, because he has some sort of genealogy. He has some kind of genus or starting point in an earlier book, which will come out next autumn. That book is called Pond Life. Pond Man is another sort of changeling child. I've had to create him out of quite a bit of thin air, as Shakespeare creates the idea of the changeling child in A Midsummer Night's Dream. In that play, we never see the changeling child. He's only referred to as being somewhere in Africa. He remains nebulous, somewhere up in the magical clouds, as Mrs. Jellyby's nebulous understanding of Africa seems to be in Dickens' Bleak House. Mrs. Jellyby has no idea really about Africa, although she's raising money for poor African orphans. But I do have to have some idea about my character. I do have to get to know Pond Man. And as I say, he does have some kind of history because he appears in the book I've just completed, Pond Life. And there he is a gardener, very much a background figure, who, when he is noticed, becomes a source of projection for one of the other characters. Her name is Dorothy, and she's lost a child. Dorothy is in a state of mourning for her child. She has a husband called Henry who's very kind, but she's rather bored with her life and rather sad. She has money through Henry, through the male line, and so Dorothy, in a sense, has been adopted by Henry's money and lineage. But in the middle of her sadness, this gardener arrives into her life as someone who's going to create what she has asked Henry for with his money. A fantasy space for herself to hide away in, a garden pond, a sort of green room, a green space where she can assemble another version of reality on top of that shimmery, watery surface. And so Pond Man is the man who comes to fix up the pond, and she adopts him as this imaginary creature with whom she might run off and have an affair with. Pond Man really is nothing more than a poetic character, a mythopoetic character, an imagined fantasy. He's a sort of creation myth, and he allows my character Dorothy to come out of her state of grief and imagine another life and another world. He allows her to move on from the loss of her child that might have been. She and Henry have no children, but they have this big house and this beautiful garden. Enough space for fantasy and projection. Pond Man, as a reduced symbol, represents this place of projection. And he's also related to the world of cinema and the screen life that we're all hooked to. Look at us now here, glued to the screen. This is how we conduct our relationships these days. How bizarre. But back to the plot of my creative life. After I finished Pond Life, I decided that I needed to give Pond Man a second chance and carry him over from that reflective, reduced, symbolic surface, the shimmery pond, and grant him a new life. I wanted to carry him over like you might a small child or a baby and put him down somewhere else. Readopt him, give him a new start, as Titania and Oberon tried to do with the changeling child in Midsummer Night's Dream. There, it doesn't quite work out. But I wanted my adoption plan to work. It will work. It is working. I just have to produce natural sympathy. And I'm giving Pond Man the whole world now. The whole world of my book to play in. I want him to be the deviser, you see, and the creator and the agent of the world in which he will find himself. Because in a sense, he's standing in for me, the writer, the imaginative agent. And I've made an imaginative choice. I want to write in the form of a fable because it will allow me to discover, I hope, some kind of knowledge from my character's experience, which will also be useful, I hope, for living. Because literature, in my mind, should also help us live better. And I began writing in the fable form in the third part of my coming-of-age sequence, The Green Lady, where the figure of the foster mother, as a relative of nature and folk history and folk tales, was created. The foster mother as a nurturing, creative force, the foster mother as the natural world and the arts, aesthetic education, which is central to my teaching practice. So I'm going to be, in the next few months, I'm not quite sure how long it will take me, I'm going to be adopting Pond Man. And it's a rather radical process, this process of adoption. I'm going to have to sleep with Pond Man. I'm going to have to take him to bed. I'm going to have to imagine him in his bed at night, looking at his toes, thinking about how cold perhaps his feet are, how many bed covers he has on, what it feels like to be him in the morning, getting up, moving about, what it feels like to be him opening the front door, what it feels like to be him going out to find his hoe, picking it up in his hands after a cold night, because he's a man who likes his garden implements. I need to know what it feels like for him to have to put up with this tiresome, ridiculous neighbour he has called Lawrence Gallows, who I've also created, because Pond Man needs also to be adopted by another character. And Lawrence, difficult Lawrence, needs to be adopted by Pond Man. And so you see, there is the beginning of my sympathetic community of characters. Pond Man and Lawrence, and there are other characters to come, need to find a way of relating to one another. And as I write out their relationships, as I build my sympathetic community, the whole time I am trying to enact an embodied practice, a dramatic dynamic, a feeling through and for my characters, which begins with the basic elements of their lives: their bed, their feet, their hands, their head, the objects that they live with within their world. That, to put it most basically, is my form of imaginative anthropology.
Get in there, get out.
And I believe that I learnt this process of imaginative or sympathetic anthropology
Right. He's scared of everybody. Go on in.
By reading Jane Eyre and the Miss Marple stories. They were my first teachers. I'm going to finish by a very short reading, some of which you've heard already, to return you back, to hand you over and back to my first teachers, Jane Eyre and Miss Marple, who I believed supervised my internal life at a point in my own life when I needed to be adopted, imaginatively, kindly, sympathetically. By the time I'd finished reading Jane Eyre, I knew that you can find missing people inside books. Jane Eyre, who reads lots of books, calls these natural sympathies. Sympathies are relatives you never knew you had, the ones you always wanted. Sympathies are family ghosts and fairies, and sympathies keep you up at night. Reading. I decided that my sympathies were Jane Eyre and Miss Marple, and once upon a time, a long time ago, before I was born, they had been walking together through an English village, looking for Verity. Verity, Verity, where are you? Verity, come out. But Verity is dead. Verity is dead. Because don't you know, you can kill people you love, you know. Yes, you can kill people you love. In mysteries, this happens all the time. Miss Marple knows this, and Jane Eyre too. Because like Miss Marple, Jane Eyre sees and hears everything. And like Miss Marple, she is genteel. Just like a lady now, Miss Jane, very proper. Look at you, says Bessie, the maid. Bessie means that Jane Eyre is small and quiet and demure. So people don't see her coming in through the back door and climbing up the stairs. Jane Eyre, Jane Eyre, whither wander you? Thank you.